Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the Spanish Stock Exchange, especially its president, Adelmo Gabi, for inviting me and for his wonderful words. I'm warning you that the speech won't be as entertaining as the other days. I'm going to give a technical speech, which is a different forum. I also want to thank my dear Claudio Zuchevitsky, who arranged for me to be here. So, it's a great pleasure for me to be giving this talk. The talk is titled Money, Prices, and Exchange Rates, but it could also be called Emissions, Inflation, and Devaluation. The talk is divided into two parts. There's a theoretical introduction that I think is worthwhile, given the poor quality of domestic debate, where I'm daily surprised by the shortcomings and failings of our economics professionals. This means that in some cases, one has to deal with ignorance, and in other cases, with exaggerated egos that can't accept that they're wrong. In that sense, the theoretical introduction will be very useful for understanding what we're doing in part 2, that is, for understanding why we're doing what we're doing. Ultimately, what this will ultimately do is demonstrate that Minister Luis Caputo is the best Minister of Economy in the history of Argentina. And that what he's doing with Pablo Cornó and Santiago Basili is an enormous, monumental task, and that only history will be able to fully account for the fabulous work they're doing. I have the privilege of being the president who has the privilege of having them do this work. Therefore, today I'm going to put on my economist suit again, and I'm going to try to explain what's happening and how we're going to end up doing it. So it won't be as engaging as the Tucumán speech. The first thing to understand is how we, as economists, construct economic theory, because that's what we then have to use as a toolbox to apply and make the decisions we make. So, the first thing to understand is the logic of what is called general equilibrium. General equilibrium is the same field of application as macroeconomics, but with micro foundations. In fact, today all of modern macroeconomics has almost completely cleared itself of all the dirt, mud, and pests that Keynesianism entailed. But well, that happens in other places, not here. So we continue discussing, I don't know, squaring the circle, hot ice cream, things we have. Quite complicated. When one raises the question of general equilibrium, one basically asks three questions. That is, does equilibrium exist, is it unique, and is it stable? The construction of that equilibrium arises from the excess demand functions and the search for the existence of a price vector that leaves all excess demand functions at zero, that is, all markets in equilibrium simultaneously. And that is then constructed from the demand functions for each of the goods in the economy, for each of the factors in the economy, by individuals and by firms. Furthermore, the firm is a property of individuals, and these demand and supply functions have a basic characteristic: they are homogeneous to the degree of zero. That is, being homogeneous to the degree of zero means that they depend on relative prices. In turn, if you look at this, these excess demand functions, which are composed of the demand functions minus the supply functions for each market, are functions that describe how each price you give them responds to a quantity. But that's not enough to solve the problem, because I can throw out a vector of prices and it will return a vector of quantities, and it may be that this vector of quantities is not in equilibrium. So, we economists create a fiction called the Walrasian auctioneer, which says that when demand exceeds supply, prices rise, and in the opposite case, prices fall. In other words, if you look closely, it's a function that means that when you give it a price, it responds to a quantity, or based on the quantity, it responds to a price, to put it appropriately. In that sense, in general equilibrium, what we construct is also a composite function between these excess demand functions and Walras law and the Walrasian auctioneer. If that applies to a set that is convex, closed, and bounded, and the excess demand functions are continuous, then one can apply Brouwer's fixed-point theorem, and then equilibrium exists. Furthermore, since we are working with functions that are point-to-point mappings, the disequilibrium is unique. And if we assume that the direct effects outweigh the cross effects, the equilibrium is also stable. That is, these are the conditions under which one builds a model whose solution exists, is unique, and is stable. Now, then, the first thing we need to be clear about is this framework we work with and the framework where we think and how we design economic policy. I want to tell you that the vast majority of economists don't know these things because it implies knowledge of topology they don't have. So, that's why we end up discussing things that are truly meaningless because there are serious training deficits. Now, the other problem is that, if I have the characteristics of this system, which is homogeneous with 0 degrees, which resolves in relative prices, that means that this system of equations doesn't give me prices for all goods. It will give me prices for all goods except one. In fact, Walras law states that if n or less one market is in equilibrium, so is the remaining one. Therefore, it's a redundant equation. Therefore, I won't be able to solve in n prices, if I won't be able to solve in n-1 price. So, that's where the issue of what's called the numeraire comes in. The numeraire is a good that acts as money and, basically, is where you determine the rest of the prices. So, the system can find a solution, and ultimately, what lies behind that are also the characteristics of what would be a barter economy. Now, the problem of the barter economy is basically twofold. One is what's called the double coincidence problem. That is, for example, I want to sell something to someone, but I have to get someone else to want to buy what I have and also have what I need, which in a large society is a fairly complex problem. And even if technology could solve that situation for me, I also have another problem, which is, indivisibility. Because maybe I do want to buy bread, maybe the baker wants economic talks, but the problem is how many kilos of bread he's going to give me. I don't need and don't want that many kilos of bread either. I assume my lectures will be a little more expensive, especially after we've moved Argentina forward. In that sense, you also know that I'm strongly committed to this because I gave up my privileged retirement. So I'd better do this right, because otherwise things will go badly for me after the presidency. So, individuals didn't start crying. Individuals grabbed hold of the problem and, faced with it, tried to find a solution. And this is important because this is what begins to show what money is.
Y esto es lo importante porque esto es lo que empieza a dar muestra de qué es el dinero.
And this is what will allow us to understand the logic of how to end inflation, the logic of the program we're developing, which is to understand the nature of money.
¿Cuál es la naturaleza del dinero? En este sentido,
in this sense, money comes to solve these two problems. In short, money is nothing more or less than an indirect exchange good. That is, I don't demand money to carry it to the wooden suit. I demand money to buy other goods, to facilitate exchanges. So, when humankind figured out how to solve this problem, one of the things they discovered was that there were some goods that were exchanged much more than others. So, what they did was buy those goods that were exchanged more, not because they wanted that good specifically, but because it indirectly helped them acquire the rest of the goods. So, this is how the first forms of money appeared. So, for example, when humankind was nomadic, the first type of money they used was cattle. Basically, why? Because they traveled with cattle, and since cattle were something everyone wanted, they could use them for exchange, whether they wanted cattle themselves, or if they wanted other goods and could use cattle as an indirect exchange good. If you look closely, this already represents a form of money, which is commodity money. Naturally, later, humans evolved, becoming sedentary. So, for example, bread was a common consumption, so naturally, currency transformed. What did it become? Wheat. Why? Because it was the way to conduct indirect exchanges, it was the way to carry out transactions, or likewise, it was with salt, with flax, with tobacco. Now, if you look closely, when you do that, you find that you already have a unit of account. That is, you're going to set those prices in that unit, whether it's cattle, wheat, salt, flax, or tobacco. It's a widespread means of payment because, given the local customs, they can use it. In other words, it's widespread and accepted. But it has a problem, which is that it doesn't operate as a store of value. Any of the goods we just mentioned have the characteristic of depreciating over time, or, to put it another way, they have a negative interest rate. I mean, for example, a good with a negative interest rate is ice cream. You go, you buy the ice cream, and if you don't eat it, it melts. Well, these goods degrade over time. That's why, whenever I talk about these topics, I always like to talk about the series Zorro.
Aparece un problema que es el problema de la portabilidad. Por eso a mí siempre, cuando hablo de
With
estos
all the
temas, me
years
gusta
they've
mucho
been
hablar
showing it, I imagine 90%
de
of
la
us
serie
here
de
have
Zorro.
seen Zorro.
Digamos que con todos los años que la llevan pasándola, imagino que el 90% de los que estamos acá ha visto el zorro. El zorro
Zorro
verdaderamente
is
es un
truly a
héroe, es un
hero, a
verdadero
true
héroe.
hero. Zorro is an
El zorro es
anarcho-capitalist, a
anarcocapitalista.
market anarchist, and obviously, he's
Digo,
demonized.
es un anarquista de mercado y obviamente, o
And
sea,
surely if the media
es
were
demonizado.
ensnared by Captain
Y
Monasterio,
seguramente
he
que
would
si
be a
estuvieran los
terrible
medios de
criminal.
comunicación ensobrados por el capitán Monasterio, sería un terrible delincuente.
But
Pero el
Zorro was
zorro era
fabulous.
fabuloso.
Why is Zorro's
¿Por qué,
story
digamos,
so
es fabuloso lo del
fabulous?
zorro?
Because in Zorro, there's no paper money.
En el zorro
So,
no hay
when someone came
dinero
from the
papel.
port to trade, they
Entonces, cuando
obviously
venía
didn't
alguien
just
del
bring
puerto
merchandise,
y
but
venía
also
a
what did they
comercializar,
bring?
evidentemente no solo traía mercancía, sino que también que traía
Gold.
oro.
It was like
Era
they
como
had
que
a
llevaba
tag on
una
their
etiqueta
head
en la
that
cabeza que
said,
decía,
I have
"Tengo
gold."
oro". Entonces, ¿qué pasa? Eran como penal
So what
cibernético.
happened? It was
Digo,
like
porque,
a prison
digamos,
without a
para los
goalkeeper,
delincuentes eso
because
era
for criminals
fácil,
that
o sea,
was
sabían que ahí
easy,
había
I
oro.
mean.
Entonces, es interesante
They knew
porque
there was gold
el
there.
zorro que hacía
So it's
combatía a esos
interesting because what
delincuentes.
did Zorro do? He fought those
Esto también es
criminals.
interesante
And
que
why is it
combatía a esos
also
delincuentes, porque
interesting that
si
he fought
los
those
delincuentes
criminals?
hubieran sido exitosos, el comercio de
Because
la
if the
ciudad hubiera
criminals had been
caído. Y si hubiera caído
successful,
el
the
comercio,
city's
la
commerce would
calidad
have
de vida
fallen. And if commerce had
ya
fallen, the
se
quality
hubiera
of life
empeorado
would have already
fenomenalmente. O sea, con lo
worsened
cual el zorro
phenomenally.
defendía no solo la propiedad privada, sino que además
In
defendía el
other
bienestar de los que
words,
vivían en la
Zorro
ciudad, porque
not only
básicamente los
defended
cuidaba.
private property,
Es más,
but
no solo
also
eso, sino que además
defended
se
the
peleaba
well-being
con
of those who
el
lived
capitán
in the
Monasterios y
city,
los demás,
because
con lo
he
cual, y además,
basically
¿qué
looked
hacían? Les
after
cobraban
them.
impuestos.
What's
Un héroe
more,
total.
not only that,
Es decir,
but
Carlos
he
Sabaje
also
fabuloso.
argued with Captain
Ahora, para
Monasterio and
evitar
the
este
others,
problema,
who,
digo que
what
este no
did they
es un
do?
problema
They taxed him.
nuevo.
A total hero,
¿Y
in
qué
other
pasaba
words, a
antes de que
fabulous
se creara el dinero
character.
papel?
Now, to
Entonces
avoid
dijeron,
this
bueno, vamos a
problem,
arreglar esto y ¿qué hicieron?
which isn't a
Había
new
instituciones
problem
donde
and
ustedes
happened
depositaban
before
el oro
paper
o
money
la
was
plata y a cambio
created,
le daban
they
unos papeles.
said,
Entonces
well,
ustedes
let's
intercambiaban esos
fix
papeles
this.
y,
And what did they
digamos,
do?
y así hacían
There were
transacciones.
institutions where you deposited gold or silver and in
La
exchange
historia
they
es
gave you a
bastante
piece
linda
of
hasta
paper,
que
and then you
hubo
exchanged
algún
those
par de
papers and
revueltas
made
que a algunos se les dieron
transactions.
más papelitos que lo
So
que les
far, the
correspondía.
story is
En un
pretty
proceso de
sweet,
mercado los
until there were a
hombres
couple
se
of
acaba el problema,
revolts where some people
pero
issued
cuando
more
apareció
bills than they should
linchamiento
have.
apareció
A
el
market process
Estado.
would have inflated them, and that
Una de
would be
las
the
formas
end
que
of the
hayan tenido
problem.
cuando apareció todo
But
esto
when
es que
lynchings
uno se
appeared,
apropió de
the
eso
state appeared,
y
in
entonces
whatever form
en el
it took
fondo
when
se
all this
apropió de la
arose.
maquinita de imprimir
And what did
billetes
it do?
y
It
como
appropriated
perdía
that, and
valor,
then,
entonces ¿qué
basically,
hizo?
it
Impuso el curso
appropriated the
forzoso.
banknote printing
Y en el
machine,
momento
and
que
since it was
impusieron el
losing
curso
value, what
forzoso
did it
para que
do?
ustedes no pudieran
It
sustituir
imposed
monedas,
forced
los
currency,
obligaban a
and the
demandar
moment
la
they
moneda
imposed
doméstica y
forced
por lo tanto le
currency,
ampliaban la
so
base
you
del
couldn't
impuesto
substitute
inflacionario para
currencies,
robarlos.
they forced
Digamos,
you
una
to
historia
demand
bastante
domestic
conocida en el caso
currency and,
argentino, digamos,
therefore,
desde que se
broadened the
creó su justicia
inflationary
prefecta
tax base to rob
en
you.
Reconquista
Let's say
266
it's a
llamado
fairly
Banco Central de la
familiar
República.
story in Argentina. Since
Con
the
lo cual,
creation
como
of that
verán, digamos, o
nefarious
sea,
institution
no
located at
ahora,
Reconquista
pero lo siguió
266
teniendo la
called the
misma.
Central Bank of the Argentine Republic. So, as you can see, not
Entonces,
now, but I'm still keeping an eye on it.
ahora, ¿cuál es el punto? El
So,
punto es que
now, what's the point?
si
The
yo
point
ahora
is that if I
entiendo la
now
naturaleza
understand the
de cómo
nature of how money
aparece el dinero,
appears, it first solves a very
primero que me
interesting problem
resuelve
for
un
me,
problema muy
because now,
interesante,
what am I
porque
going to
ahora,
use as
¿qué voy a
currency?
usar como numerario?
I'm going to use money as
Voy a usar como
currency.
numerario
By
el
using
dinero.
money as
Al
currency,
utilizar como
I'll now be
numerario el
able to
dinero,
solve the system of
ahora voy a poder
equations of the
resolver
general
el sistema de
equilibrium model,
ecuaciones del
all
modelo de
in
equilibrio
terms of the
general,
price of
todo en
goods. In
términos de
terms of
precios de bienes
monetary
en términos
units,
de
that
unidades
is, the first
monetarias.
thing it allows me is that you don't
Es
have
decir,
to
lo primero
strictly
que me
look at
permite es
relative
que ustedes
prices,
no tengan que estar mirando los precios relativos
but rather you'll be
estrictamente,
looking
sino
at
que van a estar
prices
mirando
determined in
precios
the domestic
determinados en
currency,
la
that
moneda
is, in
doméstica, o sea, los
pesos.
pesos.
That
Es
is,
decir,
in
con lo cual
terms
en
of
términos de
information
manejo de
management,
información
this
es
is a
un
quite
ahorro
considerable
bastante
saving.
considerable. Imagínense si por cada cosa que van a comprar estuvieran, digamos, haciendo todas las cuentas todo el
Imagine if I were doing all the math all the time for everything you were going to buy. I mean, it would be quite a lot. I think we'd spend more time doing the math than that. Anyway, we'd probably find a calculator that would solve it. I mean, humans don't sit still, and we don't need the state to solve our problems either. That said, and considering that money is an indirect exchange good, it means that the demand for money is a derived demand, that is,
que la demanda de dinero es una demanda derivada. Es decir, es una demanda espejo de lo que pasa.
Therefore, if it's a mirror demand, if it's a derived demand that exists solely for the purpose of implementing my present and future consumption plans, that is,
que solamente existe a los fines de instrumentar mis planes de consumo,
my intertemporal consumption path, then the demand for money will ultimately depend on the consumption path.
Por lo tanto, la demanda de dinero en el fondo va a depender de el sendero de consumo.
And the consumption path in intertemporal terms depends on what Robert Lucas
En
Jr.
términos intertemporales, depende de lo que Robert Lucas Jr., que en paz descanse, decía los
May he
parámetros
rest in
profundos.
peace, called the deep parameters. That is, it depends on preferences, it depends on technology, and it depends on
Que
endowments.
salvo que
Unless they're omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, they don't know, and it's a given for us. Therefore, under normal conditions, if the central bank weren't printing little bills, throwing a party, and ruining
el Banco
people's
Central
lives,
imprimiendo billetitos, haciéndose una fiesta y arruinándole la
the
vida a la
demand
gente,
for money
la demanda de
specifically
dinero
would have to be an absolutely
concretamente
granite
tendría que ser
function,
una
because it depends on deep
función
parameters, which are
absolutamente
given to
granita.
each of us.
Porque depende de parámetros profundos de los cuales
Therefore,
están
there's
dados
no
para
reason
cada
for the
uno de
central
nosotros.
bank to even
Por lo tanto,
exist,
no tendría
because
ni por qué
ultimately, it
existir.
depends on our
Digamos,
preferences.
el Banco
In
Central,
fact,
porque
money is
en
a
el
private
fondo,
invention. It's not even an invention
ustedes,
invented
eso
by the
depende de
state.
nuestras preferencias. De hecho, el dinero es un invento privado, ni siquiera es un
That
invento que
is, the
inventó
state appropriated it, which is a
el
different
Estado se lo
matter.
apropió, que es otra cosa.
So, in that context, if the
Entonces,
real
en ese
demand for
contexto,
money is given,
si la demanda real de dinero está dada, el equilibrio monetario significa que los
monetary
saldos
equilibrium
reales
means that real
tienen que
balances must
equilibrarse con la
balance with the
demanda
real
real de
demand for
dinero.
money.
Es
That
decir,
is,
que
the
la
nominal
cantidad
quantity
nominal
of
de dinero
money
dividido el
divided by
nivel
the
de precios,
price
eso va a
level
tener
must
que ser
equal the
igual
real
a la
demand for
demanda real de
money.
dinero. Y ahora, ¿con qué nos encontramos? Con la naturaleza monetaria de la
And now
inflación.
what we find, the monetary nature of
entonces,
inflation. Because
Si la
then, if the
oferta
real
real de
supply
dinero
of money
tiene que
must
ser
equal the
igual
real
a la
demand for
demanda real
money,
de dinero, y la demanda real de dinero depende del sendero intertemporal de consumo, que a su
and
vez
the real
depende de
demand for
parámetros
money depends
profundos
on the
que están
intertemporal
dados,
path of
y
consumption, which in turn
consecuentemente
depends on deep, given parameters,
aparece
the
la
monetary
naturaleza
nature
monetaria
of
de la inflación,
inflation
porque en la medida
consequently
que yo
emerges.
modifique la cantidad de dinero, lo que voy a estar es modificando
Because
el
to the
nivel de
extent that
precios.
I modify the quantity of money,
Entonces,
what I am going to be
ahí nos vamos a
modifying is the
encontrar
price
con esta
level.
frase que
So
utilizaba
there we
Milton
find this
Friedman, que
phrase used by
la inflación
Milton
es siempre y en
Friedman,
todo lugar
that
un fenómeno
inflation is
monetario.
always and
Es decir,
everywhere
y
a
lo único
monetary
que puede
phenomenon,
hacer el Banco
and the only
Central
thing the
es
central bank can
determinar
do
la
is
escala
determine the
nominal de la
nominal
economía.
scale of the
Y el
economy,
nivel
and the
de
price
precios va a
level will
venir
be
determinado
determined.
¿por qué? Por el cociente entre la
Why?
oferta de
By the
dinero, que es
ratio
lo que
of the
controla
money
el Banco
supply,
Central,
which is what the central
contra la
bank
demanda de
controls,
dinero que
to
lo
the demand
determinan
for money,
ustedes.
which you determine.
Por lo tanto,
Therefore,
lo único que
the
hace el
only
Banco
thing the
Central
central
cuando
bank
modifica
does
la
when it
cantidad de dinero
modifies
es
the quantity
modificar
of
el nivel
money
de
is
precios.
modify the
Y
price
ahí la
level.
naturaleza monetaria de la inflación. Es decir, ¿qué inflación multicausal?
Hence the monetary
No hay
nature of
inflación
inflation.
multicausal.
In other words, what
Es decir,
multi-causal
sabrá multicausal a
inflation?
los distintos
There is no
disparates por los cuales su Banco
multi-causal
Central
inflation.
emite.
In other words, it will call the
Porque el
various
resto es
absurdities for
pura
which a
zaraza.
central
Es
bank
más,
issues money
¿quieren
multi-causal
identificar malos
because the rest
economistas?
is
Yo se
pure
los voy a decir.
nonsense.
Pídanle que le escriban la función de demanda
What's
de dinero.
more, do you want to identify bad economists?
Si el
I'll tell
economista
you,
le escribe una
ask them to
función
write
de
the money
demanda de dinero
demand
que no
function
depende
for
del
you.
consumo
If the
y que depende
economist
del
writes a money
ingreso
demand function that doesn't depend on
y de la tasa
consumption
de
and
interés,
depends on
se los digo
income
yo,
and
es
the
un
interest
bruto.
rate, I'll tell you, they're
Le voy a explicar
stupid.
por qué. ¿Por qué es un bruto
I'll
si pone el
explain why.
ingreso?
Why is it stupid if they state
Porque en un
income?
modelo de equilibrio
Because in a
general,
general
si
equilibrium model,
verdaderamente
if they
hacen
truly do
equilibrio general,
general
como dicen que
equilibrium as they
hacen,
claim to do, if
si
they do
hacen berretadas
Keynesian nonsense,
keynesianas,
it's
eso es un
another
problema.
problem. I mean, you can call Copperfield and have him write all the functions you want. You don't know how creative I can be in adding functions if you want, or functions of whatever you want. But in a general equilibrium system, your income is determined by the value of your endowments that you sell on the market. For example, the leisure time you give up on the market, and to that you would have to add, what? Your share of the profits. Putting income into the money demand function is one of the many brutalities Keynes committed. Keynes wasn't an economist, he only took an economics course with Marshall, who was the champion of partial equilibrium. So, when you construct a partial equilibrium demand function, you can include income. But you can't do that in general equilibrium, because income is determined as part of the system. Therefore, you can't do that. And why did he do it? He did it so he could derive the multiplier. And the multiplier is nothing more or less than a violation of the budget constraint. That's why it's fun. I mean, when you have a Keynesian who wants to run a fiscal deficit. It's magic, of course. It violates the budget constraint. So, you know, if you set the income, things won't work. And the other thing, which is also another nonsense, is setting the interest rate. Because the interest rate is the relative price of present goods compared to future goods. I mean, why does savings increase when the interest rate rises? And because present goods become more expensive. So, now we're starting to get closer. We're getting to the monetary theory of inflation. Well, extending it to open economies is very easy. It's very extrapolable, because in reality, if I have an open economy, I'm going to have a relationship between international goods and local goods. That is, I know that by the law of one price or purchasing power parity, which is the general equilibrium version of the law of one price, if you will, I know that the domestic price is equal to the exchange rate multiplied by the international price level. And, what's more, if I'm a small economy, international prices are already given. This means that the exchange rate will be determined by the quotient of local prices divided by international prices. So, you know, if you set the income, things won't work. And the other thing, which is also a bit of a nonsense, is setting the interest rate. Because the interest rate is the relative price of present goods compared to future goods. In other words, why do savings increase when the interest rate rises? And because present goods become more expensive compared to future goods. So what do? They consume less today to consume more tomorrow. But that's an indirect mechanism. And why does investment increase when the interest rate falls? Because future goods are more expensive than present goods. So you have an incentive to shift production from the present to the future. And that's where you determine the Vixelian interest rate, the natural interest rate, between savings and investment. But, in reality, those are the relative prices of present goods compared to future goods. What's more, the economy will be in intertemporal equilibrium when the relative price of each of the present goods compared to the future is all the same, and that's when you'll achieve equilibrium. If not, they'll be able to perform arbitrage, both present and intertemporal. Therefore, when you see economists using these functions, ask them if they're really using general equilibrium. Because if they say yes, they're lying. And that's wrong in many textbooks as well. So, when you use general equilibrium functions, they only depend on prices. Why? Because it considers goods at present and future prices. That said, I'm not aspiring to be Roberto Carlos among my peers, but hey, I have more than 15 million Argentinians who joined me. That said, Then, what's going on? This also has to do with the definition of inflation, yes, because you can use the definition most widely adopted by economists after Keynes's appearance, which is the generalized rise in prices. Well, if you think about it in those terms, there will be no shortage of cavemen who want to fix the problem. How? By controlling prices. There's a small detail that violates property rights, and that causes supply to be withdrawn, consequently generating scarcity. But when you ask the vast majority of economists what the market is, they start trying to describe a little picture, and they don't realize that behind that little picture, there are property rights, a lot of things. But, aside from that, when you generate excess supply, either because supply increases or demand falls, or both happen at the same time, what's going to happen is that the purchasing power of money falls. That is, all prices expressed in monetary units rise. In fact, unless you're causing havoc with the inflation rate and end up pulverizing the demand for money, what you're going to have is that when you increase the supply of money, that's going to lead to a loss of purchasing power of money, and all prices expressed in monetary units are going to rise. That's why the central bank's original charter, which stated, it is the fundamental mission of the central bank to preserve the value of the currency, was wise. It didn't work, did it? Because if we could remove 13 zeros from the currency, we could have removed 3 more. It clearly didn't work. The good thing is that we know it's never going to work out. But beyond that, there's also another trick from economists called the pass-through, the transfer of devaluation to price. The size of a house is nonsense. Why is it nonsense? Because if inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money that leads to a loss of purchasing power of money, all prices expressed in monetary units rise, that is, the exchange rate is one more price, it's the price of a foreign currency. I don't know, the dollar, the price of the dollar, so it rises because in reality it's not that the dollar rises, it's the peso asking for purchasing power, and it's not that there's a pass-through, in reality, if instead of studying, I mean, only post-Keynes, you studied a little bit before, you'll discover that there's something called the Hume-Cantillon effect, which has to do with the way in which prices move. So, if I generate the excess supply of money, money will lose purchasing power. Now what happens? Since the dollar is a financial asset, it rises first. After the dollar rises, tradable goods rise. After tradable goods, wholesalers rise. After wholesalers, retailers. And last in line, who comes next? The wage earners. That's why, when you generate a devaluation process, how will that dynamically lead to wages being at the back of the line? The drop in real wages will lead to an increase in the number of poor and destitute people. What passed through? It's called the Young-Cantillon effect, but back again, since they don't have real equilibrium models. They invent these methodological shortcuts that are false and nothing more than an abuse of mathematics. So, now we're starting to get closer. We're getting to the monetary theory of inflation. Well, the extension to open economies is very easy. It's very extrapolable, because in reality, if I have an open economy, I'm going to have a relationship between international goods and local goods. That is, I know that by the law of one price or purchasing power parity, which is the general equilibrium version of the law of one price, if you will. I know that the domestic price is equal to the exchange rate multiplied by the international price level. And, what's more, if I'm a small economy, international prices are given. This means that the exchange rate will be determined by the quotient of local prices divided by international prices. And if I know that for household goods, the price is determined by the supply of money divided by the real demand for money, the same applies to the rest of the world as well.
Entonces ustedes pueden seguir distintos modelos o distintas formas de política monetaria. Pueden utilizar una política monetaria exógena.
And if I know that the price of domestic goods is determined by the money supply divided by the real demand for money, the same applies to the rest of the world. Consequently, we encounter something called relative monetary conditions, which is that the exchange rate is determined by the domestic money supply relative to the international money supply, and the international money demand relative to the local money demand. In this sense, if the demand for money and the supply of money in the world were given, when I issue money, given the amount of money demanded, not only will the price level rise, but the exchange rate will also rise. So, I'll give you a piece of information. If I stop issuing money, there's no reason for the exchange rate to rise. I'm saying that's where zero issuance comes from. That is, we're putting an end to the problem of inflation and, obviously, the exchange rate. All you need to do is look up relative monetary conditions in a textbook. Learn how they interact and map to the purchasing power parity model. But it seems we have economists who don't even know how to multiply and divide. So, now we come to monetary policy, so you can follow different models or different forms of monetary policy. You can use an exogenous monetary policy, where you control the quantity of money. So, when you determine the quantity of money, what are you determining? You're determining the inflation rate. You're strictly determining the price level, and therefore the rate at which the quantity of money varies will determine the inflation rate. Now, you could use other mechanisms. For example, you could use the exchange rate. Now, when you set the exchange rate, the quantity of money is determined endogenously. Note that in the expression I mentioned earlier, the exchange rate arose from the quotient of prices, local prices in terms of international prices. Now, if I set the exchange rate and international prices are given, then what must be accommodated? The price level. And the price level is determined by the ratio of the money supply to the demand for money. And we said that the demand for money was given. Because in fact you demand money based on your consumption pattern, which depends on the underlying parameters of the economy. So, what will happen with the money supply? It will adjust to what? It will adjust to the demand for money, such that a price level consistent with the PPP is generated. And that's how it works. That's why money is endogenous. What you'll have is that, depending on how the demand for money moves, the central bank, for example, in convertibility, when the demand for money increased, what they would do is, what would they do? They would take the dollars, sell them to the central bank, and then the central bank would issue them. So, the quantity of money would expand. And when you didn't want money, you would go and sell the pesos to the central bank, take the dollars, and the quantity of money would fall. Is this the only way to implement endogenous monetary policy? No. You could go ahead and think in terms of price controls and set prices. Now, if you're going to set prices and the international price is given, the exchange rate has already been determined for you. Don't insist on setting the exchange rate and setting prices because, unless, again, you're so fatally arrogant that you think you can determine all the prices in the economy, which would require you to be omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. In other words, you should be the creator. There are some economists with an ego who think they can, but I tell them no. They can't. Let's say Hayek would clearly show them that this can't be done. Now, the other way is to set monetary policy by looking at wages, and if you look at wages, you could build a monstrous beast where prices are.
Decía Adelmo, nosotros cuando ganamos con dos mandatos muy claros. El tercero apareció luego. Pero el primer mandato era terminar con la inflación.
Now, the other is to set monetary policy based on wages, and if you look at wages, you could build a monstrous beast where prices are a markup over costs, with costs being wages. And from there, even more, you can derive the distributive struggle model. Now, the other thing to say is that the distributive struggle model is, if everything I said before, economists are stupid, well, this is much more stupid. I mean, talking about the distributive struggle is almost like the supreme exaltation of being stupid. Because saying that price is a markup over costs implies that you didn't realize that a man named Menger appeared in 1871 and created the subjective theory of value. In other words, you would be there determining prices based on costs. I mean, at least Guillermo Moreno says it when he says it, at least he says it to your face. He has no pretensions of showing himself to be enlightened. The complicated things that can be done by people, calling themselves reasonable economists in terms of value theory and then using costs to determine prices, that's much more complicated. Having said all that, then, we're now in a position to see what happened in Argentina. Let's say, and why. My respect and admiration for Toto Caputo and his entire team, obviously. As Adelmo rightly said, when we won with two very clear mandates. The third appeared later, but the first mandate was to end inflation, The other mandate was to end insecurity, and wow, the minister, Dr. Patricia Bullrich, is doing an enormous, monumental, sublime job, because she's putting criminals in jail. And obviously, also, a byproduct of the adjustments we made is that the poor Minister of Human Capital is being hit from all sides. Why? Because she's uncovering thieves everywhere, and so, since she's denouncing all the thieves, they're hitting her from all sides, but we're also going after corruption. Now, returning to the topic of inflation, when we were back in December, inflation was running at 1% daily. If you annualize it, that's around 3,700 or 3,600 and something. Now, when you looked at the first 2 weeks of December, it was already running faster. And if you analyzed it, it was 7,500 annually. You might say, no, well, this is an exaggeration. In fact, I remember that when we came to power, one of the things I did in my speech was tell the people the truth. Well, in fact, it's the first time in history not only that a libertarian liberal wins, but what did they expect? That a libertarian liberal wins under normal conditions of pressure and temperature. It was obvious it had to be chaos, because otherwise, the populists would have continued to win. This has to be internalized. The second thing is that we showed that this inflation rate, if there was monetary validation, could reach levels of 15,000%. This had to do with monetary imbalances, plus the issuance needs and the disarray within the central bank. In that sense, it was very interesting because, and this shows the intellectual dishonesty of economists, because since they repeatedly screwed up, they then try to present the story that hurts them the least in terms of the blunder. Because when you look at the wholesale inflation for the month of December, it was 54%. If we had monetary validation, that is, hadn't made the fiscal adjustment, and now I'm going to explain each of the things we did, what would have happened? There would have been monetary validation, and inflation would have effectively been 17,000%. And with the latest wholesale inflation data, it was 3.5, which is 50% inflation. In other words, the giant standing here in front of us took the inflation rate from 17,000 to 50%. Look, isn't that a giant? Now, but then, how did this work? Well, if we say that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money that causes the purchasing power of money to fall and prices expressed in monetary units to rise, what we had to cut was the issuance of money, and there we found ourselves with a consolidated deficit of 15 points of GDP, with 5 points in the Treasury and 10 points in the central bank. So, the first thing we did was go for a zero deficit. This is very interesting because our hypothesis was to achieve it throughout 2024. And then the Toto team pulled out all the stops to help us achieve it. And there is something that is very interesting and worth knowing. We decided to cut public works completely. We decided to cut discretionary transfers to provinces completely. We decided to eliminate the intermediaries of poverty. So with the same money, people were much better off, because
dijimos que transitoriamente se quitaban la contraprestación.
And there's something very interesting and worth knowing. We decided to cut public works altogether. We decided to cut discretionary transfers to provinces altogether. We decided to eliminate the intermediaries of poverty, which meant that with the same money, people were much better off because the transaction costs, that is, the theft, were lowered. I remember that that was a coordinated action between Dr. Bullrich, Minister Petovello, and Minister Ferraro, who was in charge of infrastructure. One of the things we did was remove the social plan benefit. When we did that, they really told us everything. The number of things they said to Minister Petovello was enormous. But there was a reason for that. Why? Because the beneficiaries of social plans receive their money on a card, but where's the catch? When they need proof that they had to work. And that's where they lost half of the social plan. So, in that sense, by removing, we said that the compensation would be temporarily removed. What happened? They didn't have to go and sign. Since they didn't need the signature, what happened? Their income doubled. Naturally, 3 days later, Mr. Bellaboni wasn't threatening a march, which he said would bring 50,000 people to the plaza, when in fact he said that number because he expected to bring 100,000. And there, we implemented the new security doctrine, and whoever blocked the street wouldn't get paid. Furthermore, whoever blocked the street would face consequences. Not only that, but we also used the transportation network to inform people that they didn't need to go to the march, that they wouldn't be extorted. If they were extorted, there was a number to report it. And I warn you that we've already filed more, nearly 20,000 complaints. And we're making those who have extorted the most vulnerable pay the consequences. So, in that sense, what happened? They ran out of firepower. And I remember we put more than 12,000 officers on the streets, and 3,000 ended up arriving. From then on, we also put the streets in order, we put security issues in order. And we began to wage that battle, where we have had dazzling successes, like when federal forces entered Santa Fe and reduced the number of homicides by, for example, 70%. In other words, achievements, not words, not stories, achievements. And not to mention all these scammers who are now parading through the courts and who will pay the consequences for having stolen bread from the most vulnerable. Returning to the topic of fiscal adjustment, we also began eliminating economic subsidies, and it's very funny because we had campaigned with a chainsaw. Oh. We also fired a lot of public employees, and we also didn't keep up with inflation in public salaries step by step. And in that context, yes, there was a chainsaw, but the adjustment testers appeared. In other words, some charlatans who said that, for example, it wasn't possible to adjust more than 1% of GDP in a year and that it was a great achievement. Of course. Given our failure to achieve a zero deficit in the first month of our administration, they started saying it wasn't sustainable. We also had surpluses in February, March, April, May, June, and July. 2. Despite the seasonality of the Christmas bonus payment, then the adjustment testers started, that is. Those who believed adjustments couldn't be made now started to question the quality of the adjustment. So, it was a lot of blending and scissors. When you review what we're attaching, more than 90% is a chainsaw. But hey, they need to wash their hands of guilt. The serial blunderers need to wash their hands of guilt. If not, go ahead and grab the reports they made in December. And look how they all messed up. I'm not even going to tell you when they said we had to set the exchange rate at 600, and if the inflation path they estimated turned out right. It was higher than what we had. And then they come at us with the real exchange rate. They have a problem with the model. In other words, they have a problem with the model. They have a lot of nonsense and little math, so to speak. That said, now, was that enough? No, that wasn't enough. We had to go because that only fixed a third of the problem. The remaining 2/3 were on the central bank's balance sheet, and it was essential to end the quasi-fiscal deficit. Not only because it was 10 points of GDP, but because we had a problem with endogenous issuance. And there, too, other problems arose, because, of course, many are accustomed to seeing how economic policy is made abroad. And we could also go and review all the reports from everyone who said we had to put the real interest rate in positive territory. Now, if you had put the real interest rate in positive territory, today we would be talking about having 10 times the liabilities. Now, if you put the real interest rate in positive territory, today we'd be talking about having monetary liabilities 10 times the base, and we'd be talking about the carry trade. Like when hyperinflation erupts, with the visions of those geniuses. Instead of doing that, we think more in terms of the market and not in terms of what the interest rate is as a monetary problem. Look, the interest rate isn't a monetary issue. The interest rate exists because time exists. It has to do with intertemporal substitution. So, what had to be done was to arbitrage against the currency that the Argentinian exchange rate derives from the peso, which was in dollars. When you do that arbitrage, yes, of course. In real terms the rate was negative, and being negative allowed us to lower what? It allowed us to lower the weight of interest-earning liabilities. It allowed us to lower the quasi-fiscal deficit. And at the same time, because there are still charlatans who say, no, Argentina is insolvent. Look, to determine whether a country is solvent or not, you have to look at whether the debt-to-GDP ratio is non-increasing. That's solved mathematically with a formula called convergent geometric progression. Now, if you have a zero deficit, the debt doesn't grow, therefore, you're on a non-increasing path. Consequently, a zero deficit is the most brutal way of ensuring intertemporal solvency. That's why the country's risk rose from 2,900 and reached 1,110 something at one point, until Congress started messing with the fiscal degenerates, wanting to spend like crazy, and well, the market got us. And since we still have capital controls, you buy dollars indirectly, not directly, by hitting the price of bonds through solvency channels. Oh, the dollar's going up. And yes, of course, as long as the fiscal degenerates want to do their thing, yes, you'll see it in the price of bonds and, obviously, you'll see it in the dollar. Now, I'll tell you something. If the fiscal degenerates want to pass laws that go against the balanced budget, you know what? I'm going to veto them all. I'm not going to deliver the fiscal result. And while we were consolidating fiscal solvency, we were generating cash surpluses and, in addition, we were liquefying and correcting the central bank's balance sheet problem. And with the falling inflation rate, a peso curve began to be recreated. That's why I always mention the enormous work of Dr. Pablo Cuerno, because through financial policy, a peso curve began to be recreated, which is what today allows us to once and for all end the problem of interest-bearing liabilities and the endogenous issuance of interest-bearing liabilities. So that we can, yes, now move forward with the second stage of the program, which is zero issuance. Therefore, with the fiscal deficit over, the problem of endogenous money generation over, we still have two issues to resolve. One is the issue of the puts. This issue, which seemed like an abstraction, a few days ago you saw what it could cause. But given the strong position we have in the central bank's accounts and our cash position at Banco Nación, we were able to defeat them. We were able to defeat that bank with coup-like intentions. That said, we are moving forward with an agreement to end the puts problem. So, the question is when we lift the controls. We are going to lift the controls. And we've always said so. Not that we didn't say so. We said that we had to achieve fiscal balance, checked, internally. We said we had to put an end to the remunerated ones internally. We have to put an end to the puts. We have them, checkmate. And the other thing we need is convergence of the inflation rate. The first step we have to aim for is precisely to map the inflation rate with the devaluation rate. Once we reach inflation around 2% per month, we'll aim for a 1% monthly inflation rate. And when inflation has disappeared, when it's close to zero, then we'll have to choose whether to go for a zero devaluation scheme. In other words, it would be a fixed exchange rate or let it float. And we also discussed the conditions, because what's happening? The external sector accounts in Argentina are seasonal. I mean, what would happen if, with all the cold weather we've had these past few days, we hadn't bought gas? We would have defended the dollars, but what would have happened? They would have had a pretty bad time in terms of the cold. I can explain it to you. What happened to me the other day in Tucumán, when, in order to wear the presidential sash, I was wearing a suit and no thermal clothing. My fingers were stiff. But, aside from that, the external sector accounts, since they have a crawling peg system, are basically fixed in jumps. Meaning that all the variation comes from.
Y le voy a decir algo, si hace más frío se pierden más dólares y si hace menos frío se pierden menos.
But, aside from that, the external sector accounts, since we have a crawling peg system, are basically fixed in fits and starts. This means that all the variation comes from the quantity side. And since we have to import energy in winter, we have room to lose more than $3 billion. So they say, well, let's see what happens. So, if things start to change because we lose dollars, it's normal. And I'll tell you something. If it gets colder, more dollars are lost. And if it's milder, fewer are lost, because that's what it has to do with. Now, what's happening? In this dynamic, we're going to be contracting the amount of money, and the risk we face is that the amount of money, for example, the monetary base, will be very low. And it's not a case of tightening the amount of money so much that we end up suffocating the economy by accelerating the rate of disinflation because, by the way, the economy is also beginning to show signs of recovery. And besides, how will the recovery come about? Well, look, first, you're seeing it in private sector real wages. Clearly, real wages have been rising for more than 2 months, and they haven't lost as much as they say. Not only that, with the pension adjustment scheme, as the inflation rate drops, pensions also gain. Therefore, in the short term, we're going to see a recovery in demand, and we're going to start to recover. Furthermore, we'll have already cleared the stock problem. Because when everything looked like disaster, what happened? They overstocked. And then, what's the consequence? And, for a while, production also fell until they cleared the stocks. Now we need to rebuild them, which will push us forward. Another thing that will also push us forward is the fact that Argentina is an economy that has destroyed its capital. Consequently, the value of the marginal product of capital is high, meaning the real returns on projects are high, so there are incentives to invest, even with the old legal structure. As if all this weren't enough, having saved 15 points of GDP, that money is now returning to the private sector. While in December of last year we were discussing whether or not we were heading for hyperinflation, today we're discussing 30-year mortgages. So, as if all this weren't enough, there's also a lot of dishonesty here. We managed to pass the ley bases law, with only 15% of the deputies, with 10% of the senators. We passed the largest structural reform in Argentine history, because it's 5 times larger than the reform enacted by Menem, and we did it with the smallest number of legislators in history. Thank you, Guillermo Francos. But it didn't end there, because the DNU, Decree of the Unity, is still in force. Therefore, the reform is 8 times larger than the one Menem implemented, which was the largest reform in Argentine history. So, when they say no, they have no plan, they have no plan. I mean, 800 structural reforms, there's no plan. But I'll tell you something. There are 3,200 more in the making. We're going to be the freest country on the planet. In fact, with the reform we've submitted, we're going to jump 90 places in terms of economic freedom. Therefore, we're going to start resembling countries like Germany. neighbors that are now invaded by the German left, so not so much in that direction, and in that sense, that puts us on a path of tremendous economic growth. But, again, our goal is to be the freest country on planet Earth. Furthermore, when we complete the stabilization process and lift the restrictions, that will also further boost economic growth because it will allow foreign direct investment to come in. And all of that situation, which will generate economic growth, is when decisions have to be made. Why? Because when the economy begins to grow seriously, whether because the per capita capital stock is low, or because wages are low, or whatever you want, because we're also contributing 15 additional savings points to spur growth. But, in addition, we have the structural reforms, and all of this will begin to generate greater long-term economic growth. In other words, we're going to enter a path of higher growth. And what's the key point? What will that also generate? Resources, fiscal resources. I pledge here before you that these resources will not be used to increase public spending. These additional resources that generate growth will be used to lower taxes, to restore freedom to the Argentine people, and to return to serious growth. Therefore, we are reopening the path to freedom, re-embracing the ideas of liberty. And if we continue on this path and understand that Therefore, we are reopening the path to freedom, once again embracing the ideas of freedom. And if we stay on this path and understand that this time the effort will be worth it, in 30 or 40 years we will once again be one of the world's greatest powers. All of this, embracing the ideas of freedom. So thank you very much, and long live freedom, damn it.
Así es que muchísimas gracias y ¡viva la libertad, carajo!